Thanks for joining us today on the Polynize Podcast as we dive into our purpose of upgrading human intelligence. My name's Mars, this is Shourov, and on today's episode we'll be exploring the birth of the Exponential Age, unveiling a new model to map intelligence, and taking a deep dive into the AI revolution with our survival guide, or should we say our Thrival guide, to the future of work. Let's jump in. Shourov, how you doing?
Really great, Mars. It's so good to be here.
It's awesome, isn't it? And while we're on that topic, where is here?
Well, we are in the centre of Australian innovation, in a way, Upside, which is a great space here in Melbourne. We love the guys here. We love Kyle, who runs Upside. Big shout out to Kyle for having us here and helping us out. So, yeah, awesome place.
Today's episode is brought to you by Upside Down.
Is it? Okay.
Official, unofficial sponsors.
Without them, we wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, true. It's a great space here, and I think this is part of what we're discussing here today. We want to start the discussion by jumping into the idea of the exponential age and what that means. And part of that, I think, coming out of the pandemic especially, is thinking about network effects. And what we've seen by being in a place like this is those type of network effects begin to happen in our immediate surroundings, which has been great. So let's start that discussion on the exponential age, understanding where we've come from, where we are, where we're going to, and how obviously in this particular climate in the middle of 2023, how AI is relevant within that idea of the exponential age. So I guess to break that up before we get to why we are in the exponential age, give us a definition of exponential to begin with, and then we'll sort of put that in context of where we are now in sort of space and time.
Well, exponential mathematically is, for most people, means growth. It actually means going faster and faster. But I don't think it is actually that. So let's start by what it's not. It's not just about going faster and faster and faster, like doing what we did before and going faster and faster and faster. What's interesting about exponential, when you do know the origin of the word and the maths behind it, is that when things are exponential, they're fundamentally different in the way that they work. The dynamics and the structure of things is different, which leads to exponential growth. So I think growth is what people think of when they hear exponential, but we've certainly, I think, been opening our mind to this community who's using that word in a deeper way now. We're not just talking about let's just go faster and automate everything. We're talking about a different way of doing things, which is networked, uses these technologies, uses recursion and all these things that we can talk about, but that leads to these exponential behaviors, if you like, and exponential growth.
Yeah, for sure. And that's an interesting definition there between linear growth and exponential growth. So roughly maps to linear growth being sort of additive and exponential being a multiplication factor. Is that kind of how you look at it as well, or is that what it is mathematically?
Maths nerdy?
Yeah, let's nerd out for sure.
All right. Okay. Well, there's actually three levels here to think about. There's linear, and then there's non-linear, but what we call polynomial in maths, and there's exponential. Now, linear, let's start with that because that's sort of the easiest. Linear is essentially additive, and it's essentially about doing something again and again and getting it done well. So the key word there is apply or task or function, all of these words that are all about like I've given a job and the job's getting done and it'll get done again and it'll get done again. That's linear. Now, polynomial is a form of non-linear. It's definitely above linear, and it's where we've been recently. If you think about the history of our economy over the last 100 years, first we automated linear work, so factories, Henry Ford, all that kind of stuff. Huge revolution, of course, which we'll come back to perhaps. In the late 20th century, we had a move into what we might call innovation culture, and that was going above the linear. So we started to talk about fail fast, learning, startup culture, and all of those things that we, experimentation, etc., that we talk about. Now, that is already non-linear. So that is not linear growth. It's already moved into a new phase. And of course, the capital and the big companies flowed into this new layer, if you like, non-linear. So what are we feeling now? We're feeling a move into exponential. And what's the difference between exponential and where we're at now, which is essentially non-linear but polynomial? And that's what we're going to be talking about now. One way of looking at it is that we've got these technologies now which can automate learning, networks that can automate learning to the point where we can move from learning to evolution. That's one word that I think is good for us to tease this out. What's the difference between learning and evolution? So mathematically, it's quite clear. We have linear, x, polynomial growth, which is x to the power n, and then we have exponential growth, which is e to the power x. That's the metaphor mathematically. Bring that back to our real lives, and how does it feel? What are the behaviors? What are the structures which are now coming up in exponential growth? They are different to what we have now, which is still non-linear, but we're about to go through another phase shift.
Into exponential.
Into exponential, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting while you say that, I'm thinking about how that reflected culturally as well, like especially on something like LinkedIn. Like 5-6 years ago, innovation was a big thing. Everyone had an innovation officer in their company. Everyone needed an innovation officer. Then we saw another technology being introduced in blockchain, and that whole blockchain wave came, and that was important. Everyone needed a blockchain officer, and everyone needed to be on chain. And now, with the advent of AI tech and machine learning, we're seeing what I see as a firm both feet in the exponential world now, because for once we have a technology that can actually do what you're saying, move us from learning to evolution. And I want to dive into that, because that's interesting to talk about that technology shift. Now that we have so many different types of exponential technologies, and then we have things like, I think, two people that have really been on our radar lately, Peter Diamandis and Salim Ismail, and they had that book which is called Exponential Organizations, and they talk about this within the frame of organizations. How does exponential thinking work when you have a big organization, and also I think it's more interesting when you look at startup culture and how exponential thinking can accelerate the growth. And as you know, one point they say is that the next $1 billion companies are going to be built by 3 people, because we have the technology in place to accelerate that process of innovation. So why do you think now is the time that this is really taking hold as a cultural shift, as a cultural moment, and how is that linked to artificial intelligence?
Yeah, interesting question. It's difficult often to write the story of why at the time. Later I think the trends and so on become clearer. But one thing that does happen in these shifts is they always bring together a number of movements, synthesize that, and there's a sort of threshold or an explosion, if you like. Same thing here. I think AI has been the catalyst, but it's not the only one. As you point out, decentralization, it's all the things that have happened in startup culture before this as well, plus all the wider cultural things such as the pandemic and remote work and et cetera, even geopolitics, the shifting of multiple power centers, et cetera. All of this actually, contributes. I'm sure we can write some great books, make some great movies about this in the future. What's interesting, I think, is to find people like Peter and Salim, who are, I guess, this early community who's starting to think this way. So we really enjoyed discovering them and finding that vocabulary already being used by people. So that's good to have those pioneers, and they help us think this through. In terms of enablers, though, AI is definitely the catalyst. You can feel that. You can feel that on multiple layers in the last 6 months or so, how our culture, technology, business, economics, even politics is being accelerated in its disruption. and it's bringing a feeling that things are changing very, very, very fast. So the shift is happening. We're describing it. We're not trying to make it happen or define it. We're saying that we're going to make that shift, work for humans in the best possible way. We've got a certain way of doing that, and there'll be many other people who come in and join us, and that's part of why we, doing these kind of conversations. Like we really enjoy meeting other people who think exponentially, or at least think about being exponential. Going back to what you said, I know that we listened to that comment. The next company is going to be built by 3 people, and I know that's a very impactful comment, right, for us. But I loved the way you put it. I think the very next day you said to me, well, the better way to put it is 3 people can now produce $1 billion of value for society, or $1 billion of value for other people.
Yeah.
I really love that way of putting it. I think that sort of captures for me the purpose behind wanting to move into the exponential age.
Yeah, and a key part of that movement is the shift into the digital age, because before that we had business was essentially trading physical objects, in a sense. Now we have the information age, where the cost per unit of these of what we're selling, of our actual cost of goods, can be close to zero. So that allows us to create these companies. So I find it interesting moving into this digital age, but also I'm interested in the shift between the cultural shift from blockchain and crypto to AI, and the difference between those two shifts. Blockchain is definitely a monumental technology stack, and we were in that industry for a while. We obviously have built Polynize on-chain initially. But there was always this feeling of it's not culturally, it felt disconnected from where the rest of the world was. There was a real moat around the industry, and now seeing this, being in a bear market financially, and seeing the struggles that companies are going through in the blockchain industry. At the same time, we're seeing the rise of AI, and we're seeing this AI revolution happen. Such a difference between those two shifts, because of the cultural implications that AI has had in this particular moment, and that obviously the time scale that these technologies have been developed is very different. So I just wanted to raise that question to you about why is now, how long has AI been developing for one, and I know you've been in it for a long time. I've got some great stories about you as a youngster developing your own AI, which is super interesting. Why now on a global scale? Why is that happening?
Yeah, it's a key question, right? And again, we can speculate. The dynamics become clearer later, not necessarily in the moment. But a key word here is emergence. Emergence is something we talk about. So when systems get better and better linearly, but they can suddenly step up in terms of their output unexpectedly, even to the designers. And AI has gone through that. People do recognize that. So around last year, in the release of OpenAI was, their ChatGPT was the cultural moment that captured that even the experts in the field had never expected that the growth of these learning models would suddenly lead to this step up in capability, where they actually started to interact with us as human beings. I saw recently, for example, at the Alan Turing Institute, some of the most high-powered minds in the UK and in the West had just been dismissing this idea of ChatGPT and laughed at it. So this emergent thing is important. Now, in terms of how that was captured, and as you point out, the cultural moment, and why hasn't that happened to the same extent in blockchain? I think it's the experience of interacting with that artificial intelligence is such a visceral one. It's that experience is so visceral for all of us. We experience this gasp or wow moment, of it's like interacting with another human being over digital channels, and that's what we've been trained to do. And suddenly there's an AI that can do it. That hasn't happened for blockchain. There's no killer experience. I wouldn't even call it a killer app. I'd call it a killer experience. The thing that we're all talking about AI at dinner parties and barbecues, and our families feeling like it's part of their life. Why didn't that happen with blockchain? And so good point as well, because we always think, in fact, about technology and humans together in the same system. Unlike a lot of people who really do get deep into just the tech side. So whether a technology has that culturally potent experience is, to me as an engineer, just as important as the functionality of the tech and so on. And I think that's where blockchain still has an evolution to go. That what is that killer experience with blockchain that is popularly understandable?
Yeah, and you said it. That word emergence is important. We always speak about it in terms of music. Both having a musical background, that emergent property happens in the recording studio, in the jam session, when a group of musicians come together and they play something. There's an emergent property that comes out from that's greater than the sum of its parts. So you put in a bass guitarist, a vocalist, a pianist, a drummer in a room. They're all single entities, but they play music, and something emerges from that's greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that's an interesting part of this exponential age, because we're saying that the exponential part is that emergent value that comes out when you get things just right, when something that's greater than the sum of the parts there. So I'm interested in that. How do we measure that emergent property in the exponential age, or how is that? How do we visualize it? Because it seems quite intangible when you think about it. Like, what makes a song as opposed to just a series of instruments put together? I think that's super interesting to wrap this discussion of exponentiality.
Yeah, this is a really, really key concept. The idea that something is more than the sum of its parts. Now, think about exponential in that three-step progression that I mentioned before, about going from linear to nonlinear, polynomial, and then going from there to exponential. Now, the way that these revolutions happen is that we build on the parts of the layer below, and we network them together to create the next layer. So to create, for example, the startup, which is a non-linear version of a company, we needed the building blocks of the linear automated technologies and systems in place to create the startup. So we needed the task-based technologies of computers, databases, etc. We also needed the organizational structures that were invented in the 20th century, so management hierarchies and all of that science that goes into managing and performance and so on. That actually was the basis for then building this thing called a startup. And the way to build it is to network the building blocks that are in the layer below, but to ask the questions that break existing paradigms and build new types of networks with new flows. So with the startup, some of the things that were innovated on, or some of the questions that were asked, were around hierarchy, for example. Can we build things a lot leaner? Can we experiment constantly? So can we build learning into the organization, break down teams, etc.? We're very familiar with lots and lots of books and podcasts and so on about all those cultures of design thinking and fail fast and so on. So that was all part of that revolution. And now maybe that's one way to look at exponential. Like, what are the building blocks that are now here, which we can combine, and what are the questions we can ask that really break our thinking around how those building blocks are put together? So here's one, for example. What is a company now in the exponential age? What is a startup in the exponential age? Who will be the first exponential venture studio that automatically creates startup companies? For example, here's a question.
Super interesting.
Because what we're doing is we're saying the startup still exists, but instead of it being this difficult thing that you have to build, etc., what happens when it becomes almost easy to do, commoditized? the value of the good, as you pointed out, the value of a startup per se starts to go down, but the value of the next layer of the exponential organization, which is developing these startups, suddenly, goes up. By the way, I think this is already happening because in my professional career in the last 10 years or so, I've seen the cultural change from a startup being something difficult to do, quite a badge of honor in a way to have a startup because it was scarce and therefore the value of it was high. The barriers were pretty high to start a startup in the early 2010s. But now there's an explosion of startups. And you and I have felt this. Even the word startup, it really is becoming commoditized. I mean, look at the number of so-called AI startups that have come up in the last 6 months. It is getting to the point where you can press a button and create a startup. We saw a product the other day that creates websites for startups automatically.
Push of a button, you got a landing page. Yeah.
So this is the way to think about it. I think what's being commoditized now. What are the building blocks that are automated? Because you don't have to worry about the black box of the startup anymore. That's happening. What happens now to the things that sit above that? What happens to the venture fund? What happens to the investor? What happens even to the government policy, for example? These are higher level structures which are about to be disrupted in the exponential age.
Yeah, and the disruption also sits in the value that those startups are creating. Like, what are you doing as a startup? What value are you bringing to the world that's different than what has come before? So that seems to be a lot more evident in this AI age, where this explosion of AI startups that you talk about, they seem to be taking the technology and moving to the most immediate adjacent and solving one single problem with the technology, which is, as we've spoken about before, is the process of evolution and the process of creativity, which is moving through those adjacent possibles, moving through those spaces that are closest, immediate to you, that you then can go and explore different possibilities. So we're seeing that explosion of possibility space as we moved into this new layer of technology that's allowed that evolution to happen. So does that have a limited time span in terms of what we saw, the sort of the bull and bear market? We have seen many of them in the blockchain space. Does the AI hype cycle die soon, or that's what I'm thinking about? Like, are we in a bubble? Is this a true technological revolution? Have we moved into something that's fundamentally different from before?
It's going to die at some point, soon or not. But yes, it's a genuine change and a step up. Again, let's look at history as a bit of an analogy. So when the computer came along, that was a transformative technology in the middle of the 20th century. Now, notice that it took quite a while, it took quite a few decades for it to get to the point where it started to impact people's lives. And as you point out, the first step, however long it takes, is that first order innovation where you basically take that transformative technology and apply it to making existing things better. And the same thing happened with computers. So immediately the applications were in, building better adding machines, essentially, and the first consumer products were around, say, calculators. There was the birth of databases. There was development of better and better coding languages. But I would argue that all of these were the low-hanging fruit, in a sense, not to belittle the innovation within each of those fields. But first order, those were the innovations that came up. Now, by the 70s, we had those building blocks in place, and that's when the entrepreneurs stepped in. And notice they didn't step in, the genuine historical, entrepreneurs that we remember actually stepped in at that point. And the Microsofts and the Apples and so on, what did they do? They took those building blocks and they created something which was an experience. And it was called a personal computer. And you could put it on your desk and you could do so many magical things that you couldn't do before. And it gave autonomy to the individual. And suddenly I could be run a company. I could do my own accounts. I could code. You know, that's when I was a kid and I started to code. That was my magic moment from that. So in the same way, right now, of course, you can use AI to write better documents or even, solve legal issues or all of these applications are fantastic and they need to happen. But what happens next? We're already thinking ahead, right? We're thinking to that personal computer moment of what's the transformative synthesis of these first order companies. And we rely on that innovation too. We respect it. But we're always thinking about how do we put them together. And I think that's exponential thinking. And this time, I think it's happening faster. It's not going to take 30 or 40 years before we start to get transformative, exponential, AI-driven, companies. It's going to take us 5 years, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I'm interested to shift the conversation into talking about what is the new operating system of the exponential age. And I find it interesting that this idea of artificial intelligence is central to that. So as we've been speaking about a lot lately, we've been looking at what is a new model of intelligence that we need to, as a foundational piece of this operating system to navigate this territory this new territory that we're in this exponential age. So let's start that by discussing current models of intelligence, how they've been measured, why they've been measured in the way they are. Specifically, I'm thinking of very linear models of intelligence like IQ and even Myers-Briggs to an extent. They're very one-dimensional ways of measuring intelligence, which is a multi-dimensional phenomena that happens not only in humans, in animals, in different living species. So let's talk about that transition of intelligence through this shift in the exponential age.
Yeah, this is so interesting because notice the word intelligence is actually in the middle of this moment culturally. It's not an accident that artificial intelligence is the thing that's catalyzing this, because we're breaking open our concept of intelligence fundamentally. First of all, interacting with that AI is the thing that makes you feel it. You suddenly think of intelligence differently because, here's a machine exhibiting what you used to think was something that only a human could do. So first of all, breaking open that concept of intelligence and rethinking it, it's something that's already happening. All we're doing is going to the forefront of that. Now, if you look at the history of IQ and things like that, it's a very interesting history. It did come out of a certain time and place, essentially from Western 20th century scientific and pseudoscientific work. There's the psychological side of things. Early 20th century psychology was very functional, saw human beings as essentially still within that sort of mechanistic frame that we had inherited from the 19th century. So brains worked in a certain way. There were, certain static capabilities that we had, and we either had them or you didn't. And of course, there was the dark side of that and eugenics and all of that led to, the horrors of the Second World War. The idea that human beings are essentially fixed and that you can measure them in their intelligence and then sort of slot them into society where they belong. Like one of my favorite books, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, paints that picture to its extreme, So that legacy is still with us. These things that you're talking about, these frameworks, IQ and Myers-Briggs, they were developed around that time, and they were developed primarily by academics. You'll notice they came from researchers and psychologists, and the key word there was always to measure. Notice it's not a dynamic word. It's not about training, developing, or making you better and better, reaching your potential. That wasn't there. It was measure. And the analogy was measuring, in an inanimate object, just like you measure the heat of the sun, you measure a human's intelligence. So fundamentally already boxing humans into this static model, even through the language we use. And even with IQ, even now, it's still thought of as the thing you have, not the thing that you develop, but the thing you have. You either have an IQ and you're in Mensa, or you have a low IQ and you're not, So there's something fundamental that needs to be shifted out of that. And so for us, we're stepping strongly out of that space and saying, first of all, it's dynamic. Intelligence is not a static measurement. Number two, as you said, it's multi-dimensional. And we can talk about our model, what we call polyintelligence. And what we're doing there is we're trying to give some dimensionality to it. It's not infinite in terms of its structure, because we need to have something to understand it, but it's definitely not linear, and it's definitely not one number like IQ. And then the third thing that really comes out of that, I think, is that gives us a feeling that intelligence is something that's can be connected into a network. And the band room is a perfect analogy. The band room is collective intelligence, isn't it? It's like the more than the sum of its parts. So every brain, every mind, every creative potential in that room, in a network, which is actually more intelligent than the individuals. And so, yeah, I think there's three things that are driving our work here, and really those are the intuitions, that it's dynamic, that it's multidimensional, and that it's networked.
And it's necessary in this shift into the exponential age. As you pointed out before, you mentioned Henry Ford at the start of the Industrial Revolution. That was their vision of intelligence. It was linear. You needed to measure intelligence in the same way you build a car. It was linear. It was in that sense. So moving into an exponential model, the world will also need to shift its thinking about how we measure intelligence. And so just to break down the polyintelligence model, it itself is dynamic, but essentially there's six groups, six main groups: communication, creative intelligence, collaborative intelligence, emotional, analytic, and functional. And within those, there's particular skills that those are made up of. So let's talk about the model of polyintelligence itself, and just dive into some of the nitty-gritty of the skills and why it's important to have that granularity in an intelligence model for the exponential age.
Yeah. First of all, the model is a network description. And what we mean by that is we're not claiming that we're building an intrinsic once and for all model of a human being as an internal description. This is actually what psychologists and so on were trying to do in the early 20th century, but we're not doing that. There are alternative descriptions of human beings. We're essentially infinite multidimensional beings. This is one way of talking about us. And why are we taking this approach? Because we're looking at what is the network around us, society, economies, employers, etc. What does that network find value in me as an individual? That's closer to our methodology here, is that the intelligences and the skills inside this model are those that are not only great for me as an individual to develop because they give me a better life and a happier life, but they're also the things that the market is looking for and that allow me to, excel in my career, have better relationships and so on. So that's the framework, first of all, that there may be things missing from this, and that's totally fine. As you point out, it's not a static model, but certainly looking out at the jobs and job market and the economy gives you one way of looking at this. What are the skills? What are the types of skills that people are looking for? And we've seen this real shift through this recent time of employers valuing more and more what we call soft skills. Now, we don't like that word very much because it implies some sort of, secondariness to these skills as opposed to hard skills. But why has that happened? It's interesting. It's because these are skills or these types of intelligences, for example, leadership, for example, the ability to synthesize information, for example, the ability to communicate very clearly and concisely. These are all specific types of intelligence skills, clarity, synthesis, and we've given them names, that are transferable and common to many, many contexts. And this is something we've learned through our own experience, right? We've put teams together, both good and bad. We've built products, and we know that people and minds who have these type of skills and develop them are very, very useful. Not only useful, but they're transferable. Not only can we transfer them, but they're inherently flexible for an organization or a leader. And that's what an exponential organization needs, because one of the things I think we're moving away from is a specialized one unit skill and a career built on that one skill. The organizations of the future are going to need these types of intelligences. So this is a model that's really, I think, at the intersection between not exponential and going to exponential. This is the right time. That, I mean, this is why we've created it. It actually really came out of our own experience and needs building an exponential organization ourselves.
I find it interesting that just the way we're describing this, and while I'm hearing you talk, I can see that talking about humans as multidimensional beings, I feel like we're getting closer to a point where science and spirituality are meeting, in a sense. Like we're realizing that as individuals, we can't be placed in a box and thought of as just an architect or just an engineer. There's so many dimensions to a human and what we can do and what we want to do, that placing in those type boxes has to fundamentally shift. So it's no longer about going to university and studying for 4 years and becoming something. Yes, you can study for 4 years to get a grasp on a certain set of skills, but to actually define yourself as that person, as an architect or as an engineer, I think is going to become a ridiculous concept in the next decade. Well, actually, probably in the next few years. So as we bridge this gap between work and study, or education and work, what are some of the problems that you see happening in terms of how education seems to define our concept of intelligence, and the way we acquire intelligence is by going to university and learning by intelligence, but learning through those structures, which obviously have value in certain domains. You want an engineer to be designing your house, or an architect to be designing your house. That's a no-brainer. But how are we going to see the models of intelligence, like education, change as we shift into this new domain?
Yeah, let me go back to what you said before about multidimensionality and the connection into out of science and into spirituality, for example. One small example of that, in Sanskrit, the spiritual tradition that I'm from, that I understand, small example, we have somewhere between 6 to 8 different words for intelligence. And they are different types of intelligence, and they talk about the human being in completely different levels. And you'll find that in many, many languages and spiritual traditions, that actually our concept of the human as a multidimensional potentiality is deeply rooted in all cultures, in the West as well. And so this was a departure from that in some ways. And this correction back to that is timely, and I think it is, again, catalyzed by the external, but you could argue it's an internal evolution that humans need to go through as well, because I don't think this other model is sustainable. Education systems were put together for the industrialization of work in the 19th century, primarily in England, and then that was exported to the world. So this model is that we're running legacy software, is one way to put it.
Yeah.
The upgrade for the operating system is absolutely necessary. You can ignore it for a while, but eventually, the 10th time you're told to upgrade, you probably do it. And I think that's what we're doing here. In terms of, your architect example, I would say this, that you need a great architect. Maybe in the future you need not an architect to design your house so much as you need the architect who's going to ask the right questions to the intelligences who will design your house. That's one way of thinking about it. And so the concept of directly applied knowledge is something I just want to stop on for a sec and dive into. When I went through university, most of my training there, most of my learning there was taking in knowledge and learning to apply it. Now, I was pretty good at that. So I could be told that this is how you program microcircuits, then I would go and try it, and then if I did that well, I'd get a good grade. And I've sort of ticked that off as a skill, as a knowledge skill. So the model of a teacher directly passing knowledge onto a student is still the prevalent model. Some people tinker at the edges, but it's still culturally the one we have. And notice that that's one way, essentially, and it's static, essentially. That model is in the linear layer, and it's preparing linear workers. Because if you've been taught to apply knowledge, then you're going to get out in the workforce and you're going to apply knowledge. That is being automated in the digital economy at a rapid rate. The automation of the linear layer has been happening for a long time. It started with, call center employees and moved into, customer service and lower level functions. And now it's accountants, now it's lawyers, and people are really having to take notice, What's interesting, I think, is then the next layer of startups, entrepreneurs, let's say raising capital, for example, or developing teams, or these are the second order polynomial nonlinear functions. We're starting to see the beginnings of them being automated. And that's what's causing a lot of, I think, the anxiety, of course, because people felt like I was safe because I'm that guy who analyzes, financials for an investment fund, for example. Now you can actually plausibly see that perhaps not. Perhaps you're not safe.
Okay, so I wanted to take this moment to move into that discussion about the future of work, because I think it's interesting to now think of where we are now with AI and how people think about AI taking over their jobs, and they feel it's a threat within their vertical, in the sense that I'm an accountant and this AI is going to come in and take over my job. But what I can see personally is that it's going to happen more horizontally. So the job of the accountant is going to be broken up into smaller tasks and manageable components, of which some of those will be done by artificial intelligence. But in the end, whether you would trust or not an AI to, operate on you or do your taxes, or at what extent does trust have a real input on how we integrate AI into our working environment, and what will that look like in the future when we're working side by side, in the sense that the technology will disappear, the artificial intelligence of the technology stack would disappear, and we'll still be working in a sense, but just in a totally different way. So let's talk about those components that make up the future of work. And as we said at the start of this, in the intro, let's talk about what's the survival guide to the future of work.
Yeah, I think you're right, bang on with all of those things. First of all, yes, we have a very static understanding of work right now. I have a job role. I have that job and specialty often for life. I mean, I think that's broken down, and you'll notice that multiple careers is very much the norm. So already we're seeing that evolution. But as you point out, in the future, there's a different world where things are networked in a different way. The role of an accountant doesn't perhaps exist, because that is a word that comes from a certain time and it means a certain thing. And in terms of your vision of AI and humans working together, I think a really good way to think about this is that old 80-20 rule that seems to apply everywhere. I was having a beer with a friend the other day who's building a tech company, and he said to me, 80% of the work that my team is doing is monotonous, they don't like it, and actually probably should be done by an AI. Now, that's only one side of it. The other side is the 20%, the operating, the high-level innovation, and so on. The things that humans excel at, they are the things that the team should be devoting all of their time to, but they can't because they're spending 80% on this other stuff. So my vision is something like that we see a network where we have a certain fungibility to intelligence. We have both AIs and humans that can do certain things, but there's always going to be this split between the 80 and the 20. Now, right now is the time for us to think about building that next structure for the future of work collectively. and individually to think about that 20% very deeply, because that's the 20% I should be training as an individual. It's the 20% that I should be looking for when I look for a job. And if I'm a company, that's the 20% that I should be investing in for my humans, because the other 80% is going to be automated, and the two things go together.
Yeah, great. And that brings up the topic of polyintelligence again in this frame, which is super interesting now, because you're saying that the human part of work is actually more akin to passion or purpose than it is actual work done. So that 20% that you talk about that the humans will do is more about what does that human actually like to do? What part of that job do they find meaning in, and do they find purpose in? And that's super interesting, because we'll be delegating our work in the future, the parts of it that we don't like, to machines. And we already do that to an extent. It's not like we've already been hooked into our computers and our phones for over a decade. So that process of offloading work to a computer is already part of our daily routine. But what does it look like taking that to the next level in terms of as we're talking about it? How do we pull apart the working process and looking at processes that are more akin to something like staff on demand or companies like Upwork and things like that? This whole process of being able to have a job and get it done instantly. That's super interesting, and a direction that we've been talking about for a while now. So what's the future of staff on demand in that sense?
Yeah. All right. Let me come back to that. Let's just go back a little bit, because I want to address the points you made, really interesting points about the fundamental shift that's happening here and the survival guide aspect. And then, that'll bring us to this. The fundamental shift that you're speaking about, first of all, let's break it up. First of all, the MTP, the most transformative purpose. We've borrowed this language from Peter and Salim again.
Massive transformative purpose.
Massive transformative purpose. Now, we felt that in our own lives. That's why we started Polynize. And what that does is it gives you the long-term energy to continue, and gives you that fundamental drive at all times to execute and to innovate. And it's kind of the fuel, the base fuel for the launching the rocket, is one way of thinking about it. The second one is to do with growth and learning. Now, we've been speaking for a while in our industries about learning and how we should always be constantly learning. This revolution has made it a must-have. It's no longer optional to be constantly learning. It's absolutely necessary, because there's this thing called AI that's going up a curve. If you're not going up a curve, then mathematically that curve will hit where you are now and your job will be gone. So unambiguously, to learn constantly is to stay ahead of the environment around you, which is now fundamentally dynamic. So that's the second point. And then the third point, I think, is super interesting. You alluded to trust before, and it's the social or network aspect of work. It's teams. It's why do people want to work for this company as opposed to this company? What are some of the best jobs that people have are the ones where they love the people they work with, and that's never going to go away. So first of all, purpose. Secondly, making learning absolutely essential and that dynamic way of working. And thirdly, the social aspect. Now, bringing it back to what are the survival tips then? So first of all, finding your MTP. A lot of people talk about that. We won't go into that right now, but there's a whole category that we could speak about there, about going back to what really drives you. Secondly, in terms of learning, the shift is already happening. People are always talking about learning and so on, but I think now the systems are coming on, and we'll be building one of them, that make learning happen for everyone all the time. And that polyintelligence frame is important there, because it's not a linear process of just one thing, but actually filling out your polyintelligence to become more than the sum of just one or two skills. Huge innovation there, by the way, for huge room for innovation, if you like, for organizations, for employees. All sorts of platforms, I think, are coming up. And the third aspect is maybe a little more nebulous, but relationships still do matter. In fact, perhaps they matter more than before. Trust. it's funny that as we move towards exponential organizations, I think the core teams and the people who work together actually need more trust, if not less. And might seem paradoxical when you speak about staff on demand. You might think of this world where we're just plugging humans in like widgets, but I don't think it's that at all. I think it's actually, funnily enough, a world where we need that trust to be somehow apparent and automated immediately so that we can bring the people in who are right for our organization in much more than just functional ways. And again, that's where thinking in terms of poly and polyintelligence is important. If you need that type of empathy, for example, into your team, then where are the dashboards that show you where that particular type of intelligence lives? They don't exist. That's one of the things we're doing, is we're actually making visible the things that aren't visible right now and are dismissed as soft skills. So absolutely staff on demand, but in this new way. And so part of the survival guide, I think, would be thinking poly, would be finding purpose, and then that third one there is something around going to that 20% and thinking about your strengths, whether they be emotional or what have you, and really trading on them, I suppose, because they're going to be important. The more, I guess what I'm trying to say, counterintuitive, the more we automate, the more humans need to be human in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
And human teams need to be human teams,
Yeah, the more those human skills are important. And that is essentially the basis of what we're calling polyintelligence, in the sense is that it's your ability to take different skills and assimilate them in a way that create particular intelligence profiles depending on what you're doing, because those different components need to be brought together depending on what you're doing. And trust is a good one. We spoke about this the other day. My sister, she's a translator by profession, so she translates documents from English to Italian, Italian to English. And she mentioned in a comment on one of my posts that she couldn't see her job being replaced anytime soon, and that seemed weird to me initially, because I thought, well, it's language translation. It's one of the easiest things to mimic. And she said, well, she hasn't seen a translation product that does translation accurately as her clients want it. And then that made me think of trust in that sense. Is would her client being of say English-speaking background and bringing, say, a product into the Italian market and wanting to translate all their documentation into the Italian language, would you trust an AI to do that in a manner that then makes sense culturally to the other side of the market? So the nuances here are important, because obviously an AI can take a document and translate it fairly accurately, maybe to that 80% mark, 80-90% mark. But that last 10%, the cultural relevance of how something is worded, or the cultural relevance of particular colors or particular styles or formatting, is something that maybe, or most definitely, those AIs haven't got yet. And that's the human intelligence aspect to it, is the synergy between those two intelligences across that spectrum, both machine and human. That's important in this situation, and will be pivotal in the future of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And notice there in that example that both you and your sister asked the wrong question, because you've been conditioned to think about work a certain way. So in your mind, you have this unit called the translator. You give them an input and this type of output comes out. And that's the only unit that you can really deal with until you break that down. So you were thinking binary. You were like, either I have the job or the AI takes the whole job, But as you point out, actually there's an 80-20 mix within that job. And your sister will still be doing the 20%. But absolutely, she should upskill right now to use AI and so on to do the 80% grunt work for her translation. And if she doesn't do it, someone else will. And the economics of that will be that they'll win in the market, because they'll be able to do a 5x of work. So I think that breaking those models is really key. And showing that, to the world. I think things like Upwork and so on are good in that sense that they've already broken down things that used to be monolithic into smaller pieces. We understand there's a thing called a gig economy. The next movement probably comes from there because that's the closest, at least, to breaking down, our way of thinking. So those industries such as design and marketing and so on that have gone a little bit into that gig economy, they're more ripe for the first early adoption of the future of work. I think older industries that are still very monolithic, such as law and perhaps accounting and so on, are actually going to feel the pain of disruption more because of that reason, because they haven't gone through the evolutionary stages. So this is really going to hit them like a tsunami, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And it's in the language as well, like, protecting your part of the market and defending your market all of this is going to quickly become old language as we move into this dynamic model and this dynamic market where you need to your company, your organization needs to dynamically move depending on its needs. We saw it ourselves, having run a startup for 18 months now, post first round of funding, and having grown our team to at max, I think it was 11 people. We spent most of our time managing people and thinking, what are we going to give that person to do after they did their task? And they were still contractors, but we were operating in a different paradigm of we bring on a marketing lead marketer and he does the lead marketer role. But that's not how it works in real life, especially in the life of a startup. Especially
in an exponential organization. That was not exponential at all. And, there are good reasons why it's difficult, because everything around us still is teaching us and conditioning us for the old models. And there are lots and lots of vested interests and people are just generally used to an old way of doing things, It's really difficult to connect with organizations and move into this new phase and bring them with you. We had an example earlier this year, one of the colleges here in Australia, and we wanted to bring Polynize in there and really, I guess, break open their ideas about how to get the best creative potential out of their students. And we put a whole proposal together, but we found a lot of resistance, didn't we? We really, really found that institution and the people within it really actively didn't want us in there because we represented, I guess it was, an exponential moment, really, in a sense, because we were really looking to do things differently, and so that's very normal. We should expect that. That happens at every one of these revolutions. You look for the early adopters, but there's not going to be that many of them.
Yeah, exactly. Especially at that scale of organization, they have a lot of trouble thinking exponentially because they've been so conditioned. Their entire business model, their entire survival relies on an old way of thinking, which is defending their portion of the market. So I wanted to finish up the discussion by really honing in on probably the main point of the survival guide to the future of work post all of this discussion, which is education and learning. Like you said, you mentioned it before, self-learning. What does, I think, to give a takeaway to the listeners or the viewers, what does learning within the exponential age look like, and where can we move to from here in terms of on an individual level to make sure that we're open enough and dynamic enough and exponential enough to survive this shift? Not only survive it, to thrive through this exponential age.
Not just a survival guide, but it's a thrive guide. And I think now's the time, because there is as we said, those who go early are going to get the most benefit at this point, because it's the beginning of something new, To answer that question, I think of a story about my son. My youngest son is 14 and he's training for an exam that's coming up, a selective exam within the traditional education system, ironically, but that's the game he's playing. But the way we've been learning together, or the way I've been teaching him, quote unquote, is very interesting. Learning used to be a solitary activity. I mean, there was the teacher, but in terms of you as an individual, you soaked in the knowledge and you either did or you didn't. And really it didn't involve too much social interaction. We have changed a little bit towards that in universities, but it's still pretty much a hub and spoke model, knowledge from teacher to student. Now, what I've been doing with Keshav, my son, is super interesting. I've taken that 2 nodes, teacher, student, I've turned it into a triangle, and I've put an AI at the 3rd node. So now, because of these AIs, we have, at the press of a button, a 3rd node in the network. We can learn with and from. And the way I've been doing it, and this is maybe an idea for the exponential way of learning, is that when I give him a challenge or a question or a problem to solve, I also get him or myself to get the AIs to solve the same challenge. So I gave him a writing task. He had to imagine himself in some sort of scenario and write. I also got ChatGPT to write. And what it does is it immediately gives him a benchmark. And so his learning is now benchmarked against the best that a machine can do. And by looking at that output, straight away, he's able to run an iterative loop back himself. Even without me, he can see that to outperform that AI, maybe he could develop this particular skill. Maybe I need to get more creative with my language. Maybe I need to get a bit clearer. The AI was very wordy. I can be more concise, etc. So this is really interesting because this learning of model is the model of learning, is fundamentally different at the sort of atomic or molecular level. And we're doing that actually. We're really building that, and we've been testing that. And actually, our particular game system that we invented called Polynize is based on that. It's based on creativity from one person to solve a challenge, but always having that other person there to sort of benchmark and learn from. And so I think that's where we're going, and that's fundamentally different networks, structurally different networks, not classrooms, not hierarchies for that type of learning. And that's going to be very interesting when the first scaled models of those new structures come up in the education industry itself, starting to happen already. And by the way, the kids are at the forefront of this. So the kids are self-learning at a massive rate, and they are using AI. Another quick story, my little niece came over on the weekend and she said her school's quite progressive, and apparently they said, we're going to have an AI learning day. The teachers sat down and tried to teach the students, but by the end of the day, the kids were teaching the teachers, And so that just shows that, I think that was just a taste of the future. There's some big change coming to education.
And that shows the apprehension of people probably over 40 to stop learning. Like there's I think we feel that as we get older, especially that 40 mark, where people say you're over the hill. It's like it
easy on the 40, man. Why can't we make it 50?
Okay, well, it shouldn't be like that, because you should be
like that.
You should be exponentially learning. You should be continuing that learning, and I see some of these mental diseases like Alzheimer's as a product of not only bad diet but also a bad information diet, where we're being lazy in the way that we train our brains, and so our brains are switching off. They're just turning into mush. And as a society, as we shift through this, like, it's going to take a bit of energy to get back on that bandwagon and become a child again, have that childlike energy to want to learn and to want to explore new realms, and not just say, "No, I'm done. This is me. Lock it off. I'm rolling into retirement." That's not an option now.
Of course not. But by the way, so let's focus on the good news for a second. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, to change because of the fear factor. But let's focus on the good news. This is the best way to live. I mean, you and I know it. Like this, we're lucky to be living at a time where we can live like that, and you can work towards that. It's absolutely the best way to live, the best way to age, the best way to have a family and relationships. Everything is better when you do it this way. So it's a combination. It's not, fear driven. I see reaching that potential for human beings as absolutely a selfish goal, just as much as anything else, And so those who are going there with us first, we can see it happening around us. They're actually manifesting better lives, better careers. They're building better companies. They're having better relationships. It's, in a way, it's the way we're meant to be, actually. Yes, it's an evolution, but to go back to the spiritual point, we're rediscovering many things things go in a circle. So in a lot of ways, we're rediscovering what it means to be human again, ironically, because of the machines.